Or you,
Thank you.
but also the ranking member. Since Justice Scalia's passing, I've heard a number of my Republican colleagues, including my friend Senator Graham, this morning make reference to what is often referred to as the Biden rule in justifying their decision to deny President Obama's nominee a hearing and to keep Justice Scalia's seat vacant. This is a rule they believe then Judiciary Committee Chairman Biden laid out during a 90-minute speech. It was Biden that he gave in June of 1992. Now, then Chairman Biden did lay out a rule in that speech, but my colleagues focus on the wrong part of the speech. Because further into the speech than that which was quoted by Senator Graham, Biden said, and I quote, "If the president," and that was George H.W. Bush at the time, "consults and cooperates with the Senate or moderates his selections absent consultation, then his nominee may enjoy my support, as did Justices Kennedy and Souter." Now, Merrick Garland was a moderate selection. Indeed, in 2016, 5 days before President Obama nominated Chief Judge Garland, Senator Hatch was interviewed about the vacancy. Here's what he said, quote, "The president told me several times he's going to name a moderate to fill the vacancy, but I don't believe him. Obama could easily name Merrick Garland, who is a fine man. He probably won't do that because this appointment is about the election. So I'm pretty sure he'll name someone the Democratic base wants," unquote. But as it turns out, in recognition of the forthcoming election and the Republican Senate, President Obama did name a moderate. Now, part of what made Merrick Garland a moderate pick was the fact that he had a reputation for working with his colleagues on the D.C. Circuit to identify areas of agreement. Senator Klobuchar mentioned this. And to craft strong consensus decisions. When I met with Chief Judge Garland, I asked him how he does that. He told me that part of how he reaches consensus is by deciding a case on the narrowest grounds possible. By contrast, President Trump's nominee, Judge Gorsuch, doesn't seem quite as interested in reaching consensus or deciding cases narrowly. Also, Senator Klobuchar talked about this. Even when Judge Gorsuch agrees with majority in a case and joins their decision, he frequently writes his own concurring opinion, setting out his own views. Judge Gorsuch has done this 31 times, including writing 2 concurring opinions to majority decisions that he himself wrote. That's not seeking out consensus. That's holding his nose to join a consensus opinion and then writing separately to make clear that the decision would have been different if he could have persuaded his colleagues to see things his way, or perhaps to point the way to broader, more sweeping rulings in future cases. That kind of thinking gives me concern, particularly in light of what President Trump and his staff have been saying about Judge Gorsuch. White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, along with Chief Strategist Stephen Bannon, interviewed Judge Gorsuch before he was nominated by President Trump. They later appeared before right-wing activists at CPAC and told the crowd that a Justice Gorsuch would bring about, quote, "a change of potentially 40 years of law," unquote. So that's what this is about. This isn't about finding a consensus nominee who only calls balls and strikes, a nominee like Merrick Garland. This is about confirming a nominee who will guarantee 40 years, 40 more years of 5-4 decisions favoring corporations over workers and consumers, of preventing Americans from getting access to the courts, of favoring big dark money in our election, and of giving states a permission slip to target certain people, quote, with almost surgical precision, unquote, in order to make it as difficult as possible for them to vote. Now, Judge Gorsuch took great pains to paint himself as a mainstream nominee. He said that the 10th Circuit ruled unanimously 97% of the time, that he was in the majority 99% of the time. That's about right. It was actually a little less, but doesn't matter. But that's not unusual. It doesn't really provide any insight into his approach of being a judge. After all, courts of appeals are required to follow Supreme Court precedent, and the vast majority of the cases all over the country in courts of appeals are decided unanimously. So while some of our colleagues on the other side accuse Democrats of cherry picking when we talked about certain cases where Judge Gorsuch wrote separate concurring opinions or where he dissented, those writings offer the clearest window into his judicial philosophy. Those are the cases that show us how Judge Gorsuch really thinks, and I'm afraid that these cases only underscore a disturbing pattern of siding with corporate interests against everyday Americans. I was particularly struck by Judge Gorsuch's dissent in Trans Am trucking, because in that case he seemed to bend himself into a pretzel in order to side with a trucking company against a truck driver. Now, you've all heard the story. Senator Feinstein described it again today, and what the situation the driver was in. But I just want to review the two choices that the truck driver was given by the trucking company, presented by his boss, after he had waited 3 hours in 14 below temperature in a cab that had no heat. He had fallen asleep at one point, only to be woken by a phone call from his cousin, thank God. His cousin reported later that he sounded woozy, and he wasn't tracking, that his torso hurt, he couldn't feel his feet, he had trouble breathing. All of these are signs of hypothermia, according to the Mayo Clinic. His boss, after 3 hours, gives him two choices. He can wait there with the trailer and his cab. The trailer has his load, and its brakes are frozen, literally frozen. He can wait there, maybe freeze to death, or he can go on the interstate at 2 in the morning with frozen brakes. The fastest you can go then is maybe 15 miles per hour. This is 2 in the morning, it's dark, it's icy. People are traveling on an interstate 80, 85 miles an hour this time of night. You go 85 miles up a hill, you come over the hill, and suddenly you're coming down on a semi that's going 10, 15 miles an hour. That's like going 70 miles an hour into a semi that is stopped. That's his second option. Instead, Madden does what any of us here would do. He unhitched the cab and drove it down the road to get warm. And after he warmed up, he came back. But he was fired. He was fired for abandoning his cargo. Now, there's a law to protect people in Madden's situation, so he files a case. When it gets to the 10th Circuit, a 3-judge panel agrees with Madden, the driver. They find that the trucking company shouldn't have fired him, but one judge dissented, Judge Neil Gorsuch. Here's what I want to get to. In the hearing, I asked Judge Gorsuch what he would have done if he were driving that truck. Which would you have chosen? I said. Which would you have done? And this is how Judge Gorsuch responded. Oh, Senator, I don't know what I would have done if I were in his shoes. Now, is there anyone here who had not done exactly what the driver did? I don't think so. Of course, you would unhitch the trailer and go find a place to get warm. Of course, of course. But Judge Gorsuch said he didn't know what he would have done. Is that possible? I asked him if he had even given any thought to what he would have done, and he didn't answer that. So I asked him again. Given the choice of sitting there and possibly freezing to death or going on the road with an unsafe vehicle or doing what Mr. Madden did, what would you have done? Judge Gorsuch responded, Senator, I don't know. I wasn't in the man's shoes. Judge Gorsuch says he decides cases based on the facts and the law alone. I go to the law, he said over and over again. But so, in fact, in this case, did the majority. Here's the operable law. Quote, a person may not discharge an employee who refuses to operate a vehicle because the employee has reasonable apprehension of serious injury to the employee or the public because of the vehicle's hazardous safety or security condition, unquote. The majority ruled that the company couldn't fire the truck driver because he had refused to operate the rig, the entire vehicle, because it was unsafe. But Judge Gorsuch said no, by operating the cab, he was operating the vehicle. Therefore, he didn't, quote, refuse to operate a vehicle. So he ruled against the driver. Judge Gorsuch said that he made the decision by applying the plain meaning rule. I pointed out that the plain meaning rule has an exception. Quote, when using the plain meaning rule would create an absurd result, court should depart from the plain meaning. Unquote. It's absurd to say that this company was in its rights to fire him because he refused to choose between possibly dying by freezing to death or possibly killing other people by driving a semi on an interstate at 10 miles an hour at 2 in the morning. The company is fortunate that Mr. Madden made the choice that he made, because otherwise they may very well have faced a wrongful death claim, which they probably would have tried to arbitrate. Now, everyone knows what Judge Gorsuch would have done in Alphonse Madden's situation. Everyone here in this room knows if Judge Gorsuch would have given an honest answer, he would have said that he would have done exactly what the driver did. Judge Gorsuch just didn't want to admit it. That's because there was no good answer to the question in the hearing. If Judge Gorsuch had said that he'd do the very same thing as Mr. Madden had done, that would make his dissent look every bit as absurd as it was. But if he had said, I would have done what the company told me to do, that would have told us that he has really bad judgment. Of course, he knew what he would have done. I defy any of my colleagues to come to me after this and say to me, he didn't know what he would have done. He just wasn't being honest. He wasn't being honest.
Well, thank you.
Frankly, there were a lot of questions Judge Gorsuch didn't answer in response to questions about precedent, about his judicial philosophy, and even about bedrock constitutional principles. Judge Gorsuch dodged, deflected, and obfuscated. His responses to Democratic members of this committee were cagey and evasive. Mr. Chairman, some of our questions may have been tough, but they were all fair. Judge Gorsuch has been nominated for a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land. So my Democratic colleagues and I take seriously our responsibility to thoroughly examine his views. That's our job. That's what our constituents expect of us. And that's the point of a hearing. And I'm disappointed that Judge Gorsuch wasn't forthcoming with his answers. In the absence of answers, we have to rely on his record, and his record is not reassuring. During his time on the 10th Circuit, Judge Gorsuch has consistently ruled in favor of powerful interests. He sided with corporations over workers, corporations over consumers, and corporations over women's health. If confirmed, Judge Gorsuch would guarantee more of the same from the Roberts Court, a court that is already inclined to side with big business more than any Supreme Court since World War II. I don't believe that's a court that our country can afford. So in light of Judge Gorsuch's record, and in the absence of sufficient answers and honest answers to questions that were posed during the hearing, I oppose his nomination, and I urge my colleagues to think about that. To think about a judge when asked a straightforward question.